Great. We'll give this just about a minute before we begin, but welcome everyone. And we will have time today for questions, as well as we will be giving away some free books toward the end. So please stick around. I know you're all here in such a timely fashion, which I really appreciate. But we'll give away books at the end. So welcome and get ready for a lively conversation. All right. So welcome to today's author talk. I'm Lynne Golodner. I am an award-winning author and publisher and writing coach, and I am so honored to consider Sarah Ansbacher a friend of mine, and I'm a big fan of her writing. And so I thought that we would start by discussing a little bit about who we are. So maybe, Sarah, if you can begin, just introduce yourself to everyone, and then I can do the same, and then we can jump into our conversation.
Sure. So my name is Sarah Ansbacher. I'm a writer and author. I've been writing since the age of 15. Had my first book published at 18. Wrote under my maiden name at the time. I wrote four novels. The fourth one was a historical novel. Then took a break for a few years and started again. And I'm currently working on a historical trilogy, which we'll be talking about. So it's a historical novel, but based on true events. I was born in London. I now live in Israel. And yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up in a nutshell. There's more things that we'll talk about along the way. But I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, no, I'm so honored. Thank you for giving me your time and your talent and all of us. So, welcome to everyone. And as I said at the beginning, and just want to mention for those who just joined, we will be giving away some books at the end. Actually, Sarah, which book are you going to give away at the end?
I'll be giving away Wave After Wave. So it's
The first
this
book
one
of
over
the
here. Yeah, the
beautiful.
first book of the trilogy.
And I'll be giving away Cave of Secrets, and so we'll pick a lucky winner toward the end. Yes, so like I said, I'm Lynne Golodner. I am the author of 12 award-winning books, three of which are novels. The rest are poetry and nonfiction, and my fourth novel is coming out in October. I live in Detroit, Michigan, and my books, a couple of them have some historical fiction woven into, which we're going to talk about today. Um, I would say that I write women's fiction with strong Jewish identity threaded throughout all the stories, little romance, little suspense, and history and magical realism find their way in there too at times. So anyway, I am so glad to be here with you, Sarah, and I wonder if we could start by just jumping in and talking about historical fiction, which is the art of bringing the past to life through narratives that are either set in or focused on real historical events. And they often involve real people who once lived. Some of them are closer to the truth than others. Some are inspired by, others really mirror what happened in the past, different events and facts. And so I wonder if we could start there. And I'd love to hear how you decided to write about real events in the past. What was the initial inspiration? And then I guess to do a trilogy, what keeps you going with this particular part of the past?
Okay, so here we'll go back a little bit to the last four books I've been working on. So in 2017, I was working on a novel called Ayuni, which is mainly set in London between a girl from a Hasidic background who meets a boy from the Adani community who live in Stamford Hill in London. And while I was researching that novel, I went into a museum in Tel Aviv called the Aden Jewish Heritage Museum to do a little bit more research on the community. I knew the community from London, but there were certain things I really wanted to clarify and look up. And I went in there a few times, and through that connection, I was offered a job to work there. And through working there, I heard a load of different stories, one of which was from an older woman who, as a young child, had lived in Tel Aviv, right near the coast. And she told me the story of when a group of Jewish refugees tried to beat the British blockade. They landed just off the shore of Tel Aviv and swam to shore, and how the families living around there all took in refugees, hid them gave them dry clothes. So when the British authorities came, they weren't sure who just arrived, who belonged there, and that way they were able to smuggle some of the people in. And I asked her, did your family also take in a refugee? And she said, but of course, as if it was no big deal. But of course it's a big deal because if they would have been caught, they could have been arrested. This was a little bit illegal.
Yes.
And say again?
No, I said yes, yes. Right.
Yeah. So it was during Corona. I was researching the background for all these stories, which became a collection of short stories called Passage from Aden. And while I was researching the backstory to this, I stumbled across the story which eventually became the inspiration for the trilogy, Wave After Wave, and then Another Shore, the one which has just come out, which is this one over here. And so basically, it, initially it was going to be one novel. So initially I had this idea and I thought this is a fantastic story. The more I researched it, the more I realized I couldn't do the story justice in just one novel, and I'd have to write a trilogy. Um, so I thought, yeah, I'll do this. As I began researching it and writing in earnest, I thought, what have I let myself in for? This is huge. This is immense. But I was determined to do it anyway. And it also felt really important to do because this is based on a true story, a story of a group of Jewish refugees from Central Europe who, in 1940, attempt to leave Nazi-occupied Europe via the Danube. And this was the largest convoy of Jewish refugees ever to escape Central Europe or Europe via the Danube during wartime. And some of those who made this journey as children are still alive. I've also subsequently met the children of those, their parents made this journey. And it's such a little known story. It felt it felt important from that point of view as well to honor the story and to tell the story. And the more I started researching, the more I realized that although this is not the story of um, my family there are overlaps between my own family story and these novels. So for example, in the first novel, in Wave After Wave, some of the refugees they go to Bratislava, and from Bratislava they are meant to then leave on paddle boats. Without ruining too much, some of them get trapped there for several months, and some of them were held in like a hostel, and others were held in a disused warehouse called the Petronka. So in the First World War, it was a bullet factory. It was disused after that, old warehouses, and that's where they held many of the Jewish refugees for 9 months. What I discovered then as I was doing the research is that not only were they held there, but 2 years later, the first group of women, the 999 women who were sent from Bratislava or sent from Slovakia to Auschwitz, were held in the same place, the Petronka, for several days. Amongst them was three of my grandfather's first cousins. My grandfather was born in Bratislava too. So there was three sisters. One of them, Lottie, survived. Two of her sisters who came with her, Lily and Erica, perished in Auschwitz. And you'll probably recognize the names since you read it. Lily and Erica are two of the main characters in the novel. So I decided to use their names as a way to honor, almost give them a parallel life.
That's so
So
nice. I love that. And I just got chills as you said it as well. Like I don't write straight historical fiction, but I will say that Cave of Secrets, my second novel, it was inspired by true historical events. And in fact, I started to write it as a historical fiction novel. I wrote 20,000 words and then I said, I don't write historical fiction. And I found it very overwhelming to think about going back to that that period of time. It was the 19th century in Scotland. I was on a sabbatical in 2022 in the summer in the Highlands of Scotland, and I wanted to write about Jews in Scotland. And so I started doing research and trying to find my characters. And I did find three people who lived in the 19th century. Two were Jewish, and one was married to the Jewish woman. And I started writing about them crossing paths, which I don't have any evidence that it actually happened. But I just struggled with recreating the setting and the language and all of that. It felt really overwhelming to me, which I would love to hear from you in a minute about how you would address that. So I started over and I made Cave of Secrets a contemporary novel with some magical realism that takes the protagonist back to some of those characters, and discovers these letters in a cave which never existed. And there is no cave on Connaught Hill, which I have hiked, but it's a beautiful hill, a beautiful mountain. Overlooking Loch Lomond. And so I took inspiration from history, but then I sort of morphed it into contemporary fiction. And I'll say, I mean, in my third novel, I Love You, Charlie Tanner, there is a little bit of more contemporary history that inspired some of the locations. But my next novel, which comes out in October, it's called Two Lifetimes. Very much so. It's a dual timeline, and it takes place both in contemporary United States, and then the historical part starts in 1940 in Poland. And I won't go into all of what it is, but I had to do a fair amount of research. And what I discovered in doing that, I decided to set it in Lvov, which was Poland for a brief time. It's Ukraine now. But I did that because I was always told that my ancestors came from Poland. And as I started researching this book, I spoke with a cousin of my mother's who's 90, and he's done a lot of genealogy research about our family. And long story short, it turns out that his grandparents, who were my great grandparents, I think, um, actually came from Austria, which is now Ukraine. And so it was never Poland. And my whole life I thought this. And so I set the book there, but I started going down a rabbit hole of figuring out, exactly where they were from and that whole history. And it was just a really fascinating journey. That part didn't even factor into the book, but I discovered so much about my own ancestry in doing the research for the book, just like you, which is really cool.
Yeah. As you do research, it's so interesting the connections you find. So, for example, when we were talking the other day, in another shore, there's the Patria disaster,
Yes.
which also we won't say too much more than that. But as I was doing the research for that and speaking to relatives of my grandfather, I discovered that my grandfather had a first cousin, so first cousin and his wife, who actually made this whole journey. So they were in the Petronka too, that's from the other side of the family, and traveled on the Pacific and were then on the Patria. So
Wow.
the part where there's a scene in Utlit, there's one specific scene was actually based on a conversation I had with him of his childhood memories. He remembers visiting Utlit as he was about 4 or 5 years old, and he remembers going with his mother.
That's amazing. That's really remarkable. So, wow. I mean, I think that, one of the things that probably draws people to historical fiction is where you can sort of get lost in the dream of where did I come from and what led to here as well. I
Mhm.
don't know if you've heard from readers about what it is that draws them to your books, but what do you think that allure is to reading about real life happenings, but within fiction? What do you think the draw is?
So I think it's a way to step back in time, in a sense. I think the other thing is that this is a very different story. It's not the typical Holocaust story, so it's telling a completely different story from very different angles. So I think there's that interest as well. Um, I think as well that people now, especially with a lot of the current situation, are are often drawing parallels and between the 30s and 40s and now. So I mean, definitely for me, writing these novels or finishing wave after wave after October 7th, writing Another Shore through a war, definitely gave me a lot more understanding um, weird things would happen. Like I was writing, to give you an example, I was writing a scene. So the scene is set in 1940, and I'm listening to the soundtrack of 1917. So I don't know if you've ever seen the film, but it's a brilliant film, brilliant soundtrack, and it was very atmospheric. And as I'm listening to the soundtrack of 1917, First World War, writing a scene that's set during the Second World War, sirens go off in, well, it was 2025 at the time. So yeah,
Wow. Yeah, there's so many parallels. Like, unfortunately, we humans don't really learn lessons, do we? It's
yeah,
unfortunate.
unfortunately not.
Um,
But I think for me anyway, to read about the past, it definitely gives me a greater understanding of what's going on. I don't know if it really helps anything. I
yeah.
mean, there's not much I can do, but it definitely gives me greater empathy, greater understanding. And I think also for readers, it gives them a greater understanding as well, and to understand what our grandparents, great grandparents went through. And there's a certain comfort as well, I think,
Oh, yes. I
in
agree with that. Yeah.
seeing that. I mean, unfortunately, not everyone came through it. I can certainly say for my family, but that families have endured, families have started again, despite the most horrific um, tragedies perhaps to take place. I wouldn't say in the history of the world, but certainly in modern times, and yet to be able to pick up somehow and rebuild, and
Yeah.
that we're still here.
Yeah. Like it gives us inspiration or hope that this too shall pass and we will
Right.
endure, we'll survive. I know for me as well, when I read historical fiction, um, both there's an escape, from today, so I don't always have to be mired in the heaviness of things that are happening that I can't control, but
Mhm.
also I can just sort of go away for a little bit in the pages of a really beautiful novel and understand people from a different time. It gives us a larger foundation and context for understanding. And you're right, it does build empathy. I think there's a nostalgia in reading some historical fiction that, for better or for worse, I have some favorite historical fiction authors. I love Sarah Donati, her Wilderness series, and I am a huge fan of the Outlander series of books
Mm.
by Diana Gabaldon. And there
Mhm.
are others, I'm sure, too. But it's funny to me that my childhood is now considered historical fiction, and I'm very nostalgic for the 1980s, which is like my kids think it's just like forever ago, and it's some weird planet that we lived on. But my fifth novel, which I'm in the process of writing, is set in the 80s. And it's funny, my sister and I send each other memes on Instagram all the time about the 80s, about how we're so nostalgic for it because I feel like we at least look at it as a simpler time. And I don't know if that's true, but in hindsight, it can feel like it is, you know?
Yeah. But then again, we were children, so
That's true.
it was, yeah. So that's also so we're getting a very different perspective anyway, I
Yes.
guess.
We were shielded from the politics and the
Yeah.
dysfunction, you know? So it's interesting that you're writing a series, and I know that's very different from your first novel, Ayuni. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the difference in your writing when you have more freedom in character creation, like you did with Ayuni, versus trying to follow the development of a story based on real events and real people. So, what did you
Yeah.
notice as some differences?
So firstly, the story arc has to go over three novels.
Right.
So the beginning was complicated, and it was really like writing through mud to figure out um, how it's going to begin and where they're going to end up. And once you've started, you can't really change anything. So that's it.
Yeah.
So you have to have a lot worked out from the beginning. So that was definitely challenging. But it also means that the characters have more chance to grow, to develop. Um, Relationships can go slower and perhaps more in depth as well. So Lily, the way she starts off at the beginning of Wave After Wave, is a very different person to what she becomes later in the novel. And she goes through another arc as well, the beginning of another shore to the end of another shore, going through various challenges. So she's growing with this as well, personally, internally, and also externally through the challenges that she goes through. So there is a little bit more freedom in a sense. At the same time, it's still got to be tight. You can't just ramble on. Things have to happen, but they are happening. And that's the other thing, that because these novels are based on true stories, I try to keep as close as possible to the actual events, to the actual times as well. So I have timelines to keep to, sometimes by the day, and sometimes even by the hour in certain events. So on one hand, it offers guidance, but on the other hand, it's also challenging because you've got to fit in these characters exactly, and who's going to be where at any time to make the story work.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I said, I've done some historical fiction, but really in the margins or for inspiring the story. And I think I'm a little afraid of that faithfulness to history and trying to
Mm,
find those timelines because I know, I've written a lot of nonfiction books, and that is obviously all based in fact and research and interviews.
mm,
And so when I write fiction, I feel like I get to create a whole world. And yes, I
yeah,
do a ton of research, even when it's fiction that is
of course.
contemporary and it's not based on real people. I want to make sure that the location feels authentic and that the timing is right. And I look up, foods and music and mode of dress and things like that. But there's so much creative freedom in doing that, I guess.
Yeah.
I do think that one thing that what you've told me about some of the research you've done is you have gone to the places that feature in your novels, and I've done the same thing. And I think one thing I was curious about, and I thought about this when I was writing Two Lifetimes, because I could go to Lvov, even though it's Lviv in Ukraine, it's in the western part of Ukraine, and I've been told it could be safe enough to visit right now. But one thing that concerned me was that I would be visiting 2026 Lviv, not 1940 Lvov. And I just wondered how that could help or not writing a historical timeline. You know what I mean? So I know you visited a lot of different places for your novels. How did that help? But also, what did you have to do to complement or supplement the historical part of those places?
Right. So yeah, I began my research where the novel begins in Vienna. Some of the places uh, exist, and some of them don't exist at all. So, like you're saying, to go to a modern city helps to an extent, but not entirely. So, for example, I described the Nordbahnhof, which was this grand station. That grand station was bombed during the war and demolished in the 1950s. It no longer exists. So I visited the site where it once stood, but in order to be able to describe what it looks like, I used a lot of old pictures, plans, descriptions, um, also to get a sense of what Vienna would have looked like at the time using old film footage.
Mhm.
So YouTube can help a lot with that. So you see old footage, you put in Vienna or Bratislava. So really you do need both. Going to the modern city doesn't really help. It may give you a sense of place, so certain streets, but writing about a place that was and looking at now, it still needs a lot of background research. And you also have to be really careful. I nearly made a huge mistake. So I'll explain to you. So you have these paddle steamers going down the Danube, and I was using diaries as well. I sort of like followed the route on maps. I looked at images. I wasn't able to get to every single place along the Danube. Um, so I used maps, Google Maps as well, just to get a sense. But obviously, even that changes where there might have been farmland, there may be a city now or not, or whatever. Um, but they describe various places, and they describe somewhere along the way, near the Iron Gates, coming towards Romania, there is a plaque with an inscription. It's from Roman times. So that was really interesting, and I was able to use that because there are parallels between Roman times and what these refugees are going through. So I sort of draw those parallels, which some of the refugees were doing as well. But then I discovered there is this huge like sculpture on the side of the river of a king from the Dacian kingdom, which now stays Romania, the king of Dacia. And I thought that'd be really interesting to put in because it's this really big sculpture, but no one mentions it. And that made me think, why did they not mention this? So I went back, and I'd written just one paragraph on it, not anything too much. But that, although it looks really ancient, it was only complete, I think, in the early 1990s. So of course they wouldn't have described it because it wasn't there at the time, even though it looks like this ancient sculpture of this profile of this king. So obviously that had to come out. So yeah, there is the danger, you say, in other words, sometimes going to a modern city that you may describe things that were never there
Mhm.
at the time period. So
Yeah, yeah.
there's
It's so interesting because when I was writing Cave of Secrets, that's why I really felt freer when I made it a contemporary novel. And so I had been in the Highlands for my sabbatical in 2022, but then the first draft was done and I needed to really do more research. So I went back in 2023 to Scotland and I stayed on the shores of Loch Lomond just so I could really, because I hadn't been there and I was basing it there and I did the hike on Connacht Hill. And I based the inn that her love interest owns and manages on the Oak Tree Inn where I stayed. And so I know that all of those things, like I described them to a T because I experienced it, and I felt confident about it because it's contemporary. Of course, I do set a cave on the hill, and there's no cave, and I make that clear when I speak about it. But that's the beauty of fiction is that I can introduce those things. And so I am curious about whether you feel any freedom to add in some of those elements that are just totally fiction in these stories.
yeah, there is one part of Another Shore that actually is fiction.
Okay.
Um, I don't want to say too much other than Aidan,
Okay.
but part of that is real and part of that is fictitious. And in the author note at the back, I do explain which part of that is real and which part isn't. But it just felt such a good nod for how the whole story came about, because this whole story came about working in the Aidan Jewish Heritage Museum. And it was so interesting to come round full circle and to be able to add something in about that from another angle.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so there was a little part of that that never happened. It could have done, but as far as I know, from every diary I've read, no one mentions any kind of interaction in the way that I wrote this little interaction. But I enjoyed putting that little bit in, and I thought it worked.
That's nice. That's great. So I know you're writing book three of the trilogy, and I
Yeah.
don't know if you've thought this far ahead, but what do you think you will pursue after that one is done? Do you have a new topic, or are you just going to wait and see what strikes you? Or
Um, yeah, I have a couple of ideas brewing. So I'm not sure which direction I'm going to go yet, but at the moment I think I'm going to stay with historical fiction for the time being. So I have a couple of interesting ideas that I'd like to, well, actually, yeah, two or three ideas. So I'm not sure which one I'm going to go with first. We'll get book three done first, and then and then start working on the next one.
yeah,
But yeah, I think historical fiction for the meantime. But saying that, I really enjoyed writing Ayuni as well. That was just such a rewarding project in so many ways. Um, it also involved a lot of research. It was research that took me to the Aden Jewish Heritage Museum. It took me back to London, staying in Stamford Hill within the community. I made a lot of friends. I worked within the community. I feel very much part of the community now. So it was a different kind of research. Each project, I think, brings its own challenges, but also brings its own enrichment and something really special to it. What
I
about you? Do you find that each book brings you something
Oh,
more?
for sure. And I find
Mm.
that I travel so much and my books tend to reflect that. So Woman of Valor, my first novel, and I find this, I don't know if you find this, but I find that most authors, most first-time authors, their first novel is closer to their real life than subsequent novels. And so I find that Woman of Valor was inspired in part by my years being Orthodox, but the protagonist is very different from me and the way she lives it's very different from how I did. Um, but then I wrote Cave of Secrets, and I think it's a better book because I was learning more about writing fiction. And I that was after I went to Scotland for my sabbatical, and it's based there. Um, and then I Love You, Charlie Tanner was based in Nova Scotia and Vermont, both places that I've spent a lot of time in as well. I did a sabbatical in Nova Scotia, and so two lifetimes. It's interesting. It's not based on travel, really. It's inspired by my friendship with my best friend. It's about a Catholic Jewish friendship over lifetimes in different soul incarnations. And so, my best friend Katie, I call her Rabbi Katie, even though she's Catholic, because she knows more about Judaism than a lot of Jews do. And I've known her for 30 years, and I feel like in a former lifetime, if there's such a thing exists, she was probably Jewish. And maybe I was Catholic, I don't know. But so this is sort of the incarnation of that, that idea. But what's funny is that the next series of novels that I'm working on look to be a trilogy. And so all of my books so far have been standalones. And I know that from a marketing perspective and from building your audience relationship perspective, writing a series is usually a better way to go because if people like one book, they're going to want to read the others. Um, when I started planning this next one, I didn't know I would be doing a series, but all of a sudden this like 3 book series just came out in the planning. So I think that'll be interesting to explore to see what it's like to write a series versus standalone
Mm.
novels.
There's something nice as well about writing a series, in that when you write a novel, you get very attached to the characters. So when I finished Ayuri, there was something really sad about saying goodbye to them. You spend so much time with these friends,
Yes,
imaginary friends, and then you say goodbye to them. Then the book is done and it goes out into the world and it belongs to everyone else. It's no longer yours in a
right,
sense.
right, yes,
Um, and so the chance now to write a series of novels with these characters and follow them through. So you finish a novel and it's not exactly goodbye, you carry on. So there's something rather nice about doing that, and I'm quite enjoying it. I'll probably be really sad at the end of book
yeah,
three to say goodbye. But on the other hand, perhaps because I have spent that much longer with them, there's also I think there may be also this feeling, on the one hand, sadness to let the story go, but on the other hand, it's time for a new challenge now. So I kind of feel it's a little bit of both. You were asking as well whether any of it reflects my real life. Um, Not exactly. I would say Ione not really, because I didn't grow up in Stamford Hill. I grew up within the Jewish community, yes, but in another suburb in London. I do know it. I have friends who live there. So I would say not really my story. I mean, it could have been, I guess, with different circumstances, but I don't come from a Hasidic home. So this was a lot of research and speaking to friends who have grown up within a Hasidic home to make sure that I get it right. I studied as well. I was in a seminary, so there were some girls there who were from Hasidic homes, and also a friend of mine who was Adani. So I had both sides. So in that sense, yes, I guess I drew from real life from friends, but I didn't grow up in a Hasidic home. So the experiences of Miri in that story are not exactly mine. Passage from Aden, obviously, those are true stories. So there was a little bit of me in it, experiences and conversations I had in the museum. And as I said, wave after wave. So this is not exactly my family history, but there are definite overlaps between my own family's history and the events in these novels. And there's also one little part that I put in Another Shore. If you remember, there's a wedding that takes place in a synagogue in Vienna. So you have Isaac, and he's waiting for his cousin's wedding, and then there's another couple who get married just before. The bride is from Vienna and the groom is from Bratislava. So actually, that was based on my grandparents. So that little story. So what happens next is Isaac's family. My grandparents told the story of what happened to the couple that married after them. I don't know who that couple was or who they were, but yeah, they married. They basically sort of like left in a hurry. They were that day it was Lag BaOmer, and the couples they were just marrying them, and they were leaving as fast as possible. But yeah, so that's a little bit of a I don't know what you call it, like a little nugget of truth in there of my own family.
Yeah, I think authors bring part of themselves in some way into each book.
Yeah.
Maybe not an identical match to the story, but there are parts of us in every book, you know, things that we notice or that we remember or experienced. I will say, when I started writing Woman of Valor, I envisioned it as a three-book series, and I have written book two twice, and I don't like either version. And so they sit literally in a drawer. I've printed out both, and so they sit in a drawer. And I would love to go back to them one day and make it a book that I feel I can publish, but then I keep having new ideas. So, you know,
You know what? But you know what? Some books are meant to have a sequel and some just aren't.
that's true.
Initially, I thought I was going to write a sequel to Ione. I really thought it'd be nice to it. And with reflection from a distance, because I really wanted to carry on with the characters, but I realized, you know what? This is fine as it is. To carry it on, it sometimes you can kind of make too much of it and it just gets a little bit boring. I think sometimes you've got to you know it lands on a high at the end and then you have to leave it. That
I will
and I
say,
had this
go ahead.
no, so I had this once before. So when I told you I wrote novels before, so there's one I wrote called Far from the Place We Called Home. So that was my first historical novel. Um, and that, interestingly enough, also starts in Vienna. It's the story of and that's written under my maiden name, Sarah Schleimer. And it's about a group of boys who go on travel on the Kindertransport to England, who are then evacuated into the countryside. And that was published at the time by Feldheim. And the pub or the editor at the time thought, I think maybe we should have a sequel. And I really didn't want to write the sequel because they were young boys. And I thought, as they grow up, that magic is going to change. The friendships, that it's not going to stay the same because they're all going to travel and end up in different places and their stories are going to be different. And I did start working on a sequel because they were saying, come on, do it. And then when I showed them how it would end up with them as old like adults now in different places, they went, "You're right, this isn't going to work. Just leave it." And
Yeah,
just leave it. It was a bit annoying because I did a lot of work
the
on
work.
it, and then, but at
Yeah,
the same time, there was a sense of, I guess, there was a kind of sense of relief because in my heart, I knew that it wouldn't work to write a sequel for that. I think some novels need to be a series, to have a sequel or trilogy, and some novels just need to be a standalone
yeah,
and
I think you're right.
just stand as they are.
I will. Maybe I'll go back to those. Maybe I won't. We'll see.
But you know what? You may be able to go back to them and not necessarily write it as a sequel, but develop into something else as well.
Yeah,
So that's also a possibility.
a very good point. Well, I want to turn to our audience and see if anybody has questions for me or for Sarah before we do our book giveaway. So feel free to either unmute yourself and ask the question or put it in the chat. and we would be delighted to answer. So, is there anybody who'd like to ask us something?
Oh, I'll go first then. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
It's hello.
Hi, John.
Nice to finally actually see you.
I
Was it?
know, after all this
I
time.
have so many questions, but first of all, how do you see yourselves uh, in connection to your Jewish past? Do you see yourselves as a Jewish person who writes, or do you see yourself as a writer who is Jewish in
Ooh,
essence?
that's a really good question. I will say that when I pivoted from writing nonfiction to writing novels, and I was developing my author brand, since I have a marketing background, I really looked at my body of work, both in poetry and nonfiction and journalism. And what I saw was a thread of Jewish identity through everything. And so, and also, given the way the book publishing industry is these days, which is not very welcoming or warm for Jewish authors and Jewish topics, I decided I am a rebel author. I'm a very rebellious personality that I would. My goal was to include positive Jewish representation in anything I write, and that I wanted to be known for that. Even if it landed me on a blacklist or people didn't want to read my books, I wanted to make sure that I could do whatever I can in my power to add positive Jewish representation into the world. And so when I write, even some of my books are very Jewish and some just happen to have Jewish identity and it's just as part of the story. It is really important to me to do that. And so I think my Jewish identity and my author identity are braided together. How about you, Sarah?
I was about to say the same thing. They were woven together, very, very much so. That every novel or every book I've ever written has got Jewish themes, Jewish characters in them, because that's my experience and the life I've lived. So it's what I know to write. I think to try and write something that didn't have any Jewish themes whatsoever would be a little bit difficult because or would feel that I wasn't putting the whole of myself into it. So yeah, I think as well that the two very much interwoven with each other. And also I feel that it's really important for us to tell our stories because a lot of them are forgotten otherwise. People will go for how should we say, like sometimes the not even the easier themes, but topics that are more well known, um, but not necessarily writing it from a personal point of view, but maybe from a more marketing point of view. So it's certain topics of the Holocaust become very big, so it's seen more as an opportunity, and it's fiction based on a little bit of truth. Um, But I think if someone hasn't got any real background or understanding, I don't know if it's written with the same kind of heart, if that makes sense. Um,
I think it's a great question, John, and I appreciate it. And I'll just add one thing that I think that, I mean, I know that reading novels helps to build empathy and build bridges of understanding. I've read about so many cultures and identities that I don't know anything about in novels, and it opens the world for me. And so I'm hoping that my books do the same for others. And in fact, I spoke to a book club of women in the United States who none of them were Jewish. They didn't know any Jewish people. They wanted to hear from me after Woman of Valor. And there's a lot of food in my books. And so they actually went out of their way to find recipes for the different Jewish dishes that were in the book. And they made them for their book club. And I was on Zoom with them, but they were having matzo ball soup and they were having other things. And I thought that
oh,
was
that's so sweet. That's
yeah.
lovely.
So it's like that's their one introduction, and it was a positive one. And I felt like that I really did my job. So
You
thank
know,
you.
Oh, that's great.
talking about different
So,
communities, one of the inspirations for me writing Ayuni was the novel Brick Lane by Monica Ali, which is a story of the Bangladeshi community who lived in Brick Lane in the East End. And it was so interesting to learn in depth from someone from the community to learn more about the community. And I think, that's really important. I wanted to do something very similar, showing we've got so many different kinds of communities, and I wanted to also show something of our different communities from an insider perspective.
Yeah, thanks for your question, John. And I see one from Missy in the chat. And Sarah, she's asking if you've needed to consider legalities in writing about actual characters in historical fiction. Are there any legal concerns or things that you have to do when you're writing about real people?
That's a really, really good point. Um, I spoke to a journalist about this, and apparently, if someone's no longer alive, you cannot libel the dead. But I think there's still a sensitivity when you deal with real people. Most of my characters are fictitious. So you have fictitious characters, but they're a composite of real people who went through the experiences. But occasionally there are real people who cross paths with them. So, for example, in Wave After Wave, you have someone who's mentioned called Fritz Steiner. So you may remember the name in passing in Another Shore, that they cross paths, and there's a little bit of a backstory what happened to Fritz Steiner. It's a very small little cameo role, but he's real. And his son, I know his son, I'm friendly with him, and he gave me the backstory to his father. So it was a nod to honor him. So in that case, I had full permission to mention him. Um, so there were no legalities in that instance at all. A lot of people are really happy when they have their family members mentioned in there as well. Um,
I could jump in. I'll just say one thing, Sarah. So with Cave of Secrets, because I had characters based on historical people from the 19th century, I actually pursued, I wanted to visit their family estate outside of Edinburgh, and I contacted their descendants and asked if I could come and interview them and learn about their ancestors who have been written about very publicly. Um, they said that they didn't want their ancestors fictionalized and they didn't want to meet with me. And so I actually shared their email with my business attorney and asked him, can I use their true names in the book? And he said, probably it's fine, but why not just fictionalize them? Because you
mhm,
don't want to invite any kind of, nuisance of, from their family or their descendants and everything.
mhm.
So I was disappointed, but and out of respect, I decided, okay, then I'm just going to fictionalize the names. And that way, when I give talks, I do say, here's who they're based on and whatever, but
Yeah.
it's not in print anywhere. So, yeah.
I think sometimes sensitivity is there, that it is nicer to use perhaps another name. I mean, it all depends on the circumstances of how you're writing about them, what you're saying about them, how well known the family is, or if these people have gone into obscurity, so it's not going to make much difference anyway. So I think it really depends on the individual circumstance how you deal with that. But it's certainly easier when you're writing about historical figures than people from present day. So
Yeah.
that must be a whole other challenge.
Yeah, in the novel that I just started writing that takes place in the 80s, it involves big name tennis and hockey. And so I actually have to consult my attorney and see if I can use the actual league names and
Mm,
Grand Slam tournaments and all of that, and what I can use and what I can't use, because
mhm.
those are ongoing. And so in different when people are still alive, it's sort of tricky. And I also wonder if I can invoke any of the tennis stars of the 80s in the book, or if I just have to sort of allude to something but not use names. And so that I think
Mhm.
it's a concern, and it's good to investigate before we put something into print, for sure.
Definitely. You don't want to start having to unpick half the story.
Right, right. Does anybody else have a question before we do a giveaway? Brian, yes. Oh,
See, okay. Well, it's lovely to see you two because I've read both of your books and really enjoyed them. And and it's lovely to hear an interaction between authors because, the questions you ask each other and comment on is so helpful and it's enlightening, I guess. Um, but as a non-author, uh, but more of a reader and one that speaks to a lot of book clubs and caters to their interests. So I was wondering what your input from readers gives you. Does that guide you or lead you onto any new paths?
Sarah, what about you?
Ooh. Um, it's
And it's
interesting.
okay if you just want to. No, I don't want to hear what readers say. I just want to do my thing.
No, well, what's really interesting is sometimes they give some of their stories as well and how it touched them. So
Right,
that's really interesting. So they say, I read this, and then my grandfather, whatever. So, for example, with Aidan, my grandfather was an Aidan, and they're telling you their stories.
right,
So that opens up. One, it makes it sometimes very real,
right.
and it opens up ideas for other stories.
Yeah.
Um, there was one interesting thing. Someone wrote just before Wave After Wave came out. Someone wrote a review and saying the only thing is they didn't realize another show was coming out. Saying the only thing it was really great, but I wanted to know what happened afterwards. And I thought if that was the only problem, then that's okay because you're going to find
You're
out
going
what
to get
happens
it.
next. Yes. So
That's the best kind of compliment I can hear. Yeah, that's
Well,
wonderful.
when I was reading Wave After Wave, that's the second one, right?
First one.
so Wave After Wave is the first, and then you've got Another Shore,
Oh,
which
Another
is
Shore.
yeah,
Okay. Well,
yeah,
when as I was reading Another Shore, and I'm getting
yeah.
towards the end, and I'm saying, okay, we're gonna have another one. I know we're gonna have another one,
Yes.
and looking forward to that, because yeah, because of course I knew that, the second one was coming, but
Mhm.
I didn't realize that there was going to be a third one. But as I
Yes.
approached the end, I felt sure you were going to take care of that.
Yes, yes, I am.
Yeah.
We'll sort of like at the end we'll connect everything and everyone's story arcs, what happens to them.
You'll feel
Right. And it was such an interesting Holocaust story too, because it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't a typical, and having read a lot of
Mhm.
Holocaust memoirs and historical fiction, um, it's so interesting to hear a different story. I mean, something that was, there are so many different sides to those stories.
Yeah.
This journey was so interesting. So
Mhm.
I will
thank you.
say that I've gotten feedback from people who want both Cave of Secrets and Charlie Tanner to have sequels, and I never even considered doing them. Woman of Valor, I considered and
Mhm.
have written, as I said. But Cave of Secrets, I mean, I think both. There's enough there that the characters could go on and do more. But for me as a writer, it did. I just felt like it was done. It was good, and so I don't think I'll go back there. But
I
like,
think
yeah.
I know with Charlie Tanner, Lynn, I felt like, which I loved. I loved that book.
Thank you.
You felt like it was in a good place.
Yeah.
You felt good. You felt like the character, of course, was going to go on, but you felt good about
Yeah.
where she was and where she was going. So
I,
it didn't really need that. Yeah,
I
I agree. I agree.
I think they were just curious, but I'm like, oh, it just
Yeah, yeah.
occurred to me. But it's
And they
funny
want you
because
to answer the question.
right. But I knew that I wanted to write a book that had tennis in it because I'm a big tennis player, and I'm so nostalgic for the '80s that I
Yeah.
thought, okay, I really want the next book I work on, especially because Two Lifetimes is a lot heavier, and because it has a Holocaust connection too. And so I started planning it, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, these characters are going on for like 25 years. And I'm like, wow, so I have 3 books here. Oh, I didn't see that coming. So that's really funny too, because I just thought I'd do one book. It's tennis in the '80s, it's fine. But apparently we get all the way.
Okay. Well, I'm patiently waiting.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, all right. This has been amazing. And I think it's time to give away books. And
I think John had another question before we do, so let's go back to John.
Oh,
okay.
I did, but I don't want to interrupt if you need to get on. Just very quickly, sorry, I know that you're probably pressed for time. At what point do you say to yourselves, if you're writing historical fiction, of where does historical accuracy ends, and you go, oh, that's a bit dull. I'll make it more embellished by writing a bit of fiction because this is more exciting than real life. Because real life can be boring at lots of times.
That is true. That is so true. And Sarah, do you have a quick answer to that? Because we
Yeah,
should go on to the giveaway.
Yeah, I would say that those boring parts or whatever you shorten, and then the more interesting events you lengthen. So you may need to skim over something that happens, but you could do that within a paragraph or two, and the major events, then you can hone in on those. So, and I think also as well, historical fiction shouldn't just be about the external events, but it's also about the characters and their internal journey. So I think you can also make events more interesting because you've got the interaction between characters. So I think
yeah,
that so where a historical or section or something that's happening may not be so interesting, but the dynamics between the characters can be very interesting. So it can actually give you an opportunity to develop characters. So you don't just have it go 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 and events, but you can use those quieter moments to develop the dynamics between characters in your novel. What about you?
Um, I mean, I'm not writing straight historical fiction, so it isn't as much of an issue for me, I think. But I think that when there is more of a mundane part to someone's life or to history, that's where you sort of amp up the relationships in the book. And so that's where something can happen between the characters as opposed to just sort of staying faithful to the more boring parts of your.
Exactly that, yeah.
So I think that that's the way to address that. But I think that the way you've mentioned it makes a lot of sense for sure. I'd like to put in the chat links to both Wave After Wave and Cave of Secrets. And also, I think we should give a book away to somebody who's lucky there. So I wonder, Sarah, if you'd like to choose someone from the audience who will be receiving Cave of Secrets, and I can select somebody who's going to win Wave After Wave.
Okay, so how we can do this? I'm just going to kind of flick it through and then just put my cursor wherever it lands. Okay, I have Maureen McGurty.
It's going to win Cave of Secrets. Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Maureen, if you could message me with your preferred version, if you want ebook, audiobook, or paperback, and then of course your address if you want the paperback. And then who is going to win Wave After Wave? Let's take a look and see. And it's going to be Michelle Boyer. So Michelle, if you could put in the chat how you'd like to receive Sarah's book as well, that would be.
I think for me it's going to be just I'm going to give a paperback away, which is probably going to be the easiest.
Okay, so then we need an address for mail.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, I love that you all have been here. Thank you for sharing your Sunday with us. Sarah, thank you so much for giving us some insight into your beautiful writing. And I hope
thank you for
that,
having me.
of course, of course. And if anybody chooses to read our books, please, we would love it if you would leave a review. Authors love that. I never realized until I became a fiction author how important the reviews are. So please, please do that. And I look forward to seeing you guys on a future event. In fact, before we go, I will share with you our next event. I've been doing these author talks this year, and I will be hosting them throughout the year. So I have a couple coming up in May. I'm going to just put the link in the chat. You can find a bunch of events there, but I'm doing a book launch on May 20th. It's a poetry book launch with Sunshine Lately is her name. And then on May 28th, we'll be talking about friendship fiction with Annie Catherine. And you can register for those events there as well. They're all free. So, all right. Thank you so much. Nice to see everybody. And I look forward to talking with you more when your next book comes out, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Take
All right.
care.
Thank you.
Bye.
well, thank you.
Thanks a lot.